In his monumental study of the Corpus Hermeticum, A.J. Festugière-Kahn concluded that the body of philosophical and initiatory writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus was a purely literary production. Against the idea that the Hermetica originated in a living spiritual tradition with Egyptian roots, he argued that their content was drawn entirely from the intellectual topoi of the Greek philosophical schools. The spiritual atmosphere of the tractates, the Egyptian names and locale, the allusions to cult mystery and initiation, he dismissed as window dressing, lending an aura of sanctity to an otherwise mundane and incoherent amalgam of Platonic and Stoic ideas. However, the discovery of Hermetic materials in Coptic, amongst the remains of the Nag Hammadi library, has since led to a rethinking of this assessment, both with respect to the Egyptian provenance of the corpus and its relationship to Gnosticism. Clearly, the Egyptian Gnostics responsible for the Nag Hammadi collection saw in the Hermetic revelations a kindred and edifying spiritual literature worthy of inclusion amongst their own sacred texts. Garth Bowden has argued persuasively that the Hermetica present a practical spiritual way, grounded in the same dynamic and cosmopolitan Upper Egyptian milieu that produced the Nag Hammadi scriptures, the 34 Kyle A. Fraser alchemical literature, and the eclectic ritual papyri of the Thieves' Cache. He has demonstrated that many of the alleged doctrinal inconsistencies between the tractates, e.g. between dualist and monist tendencies, actually reflect different stages of initiation in a progressive spiritual itinerarium. Unfortunately, as Bowden concedes, there is virtually no independent evidence upon which we can reconstruct the social context of the individual practitioners or circles of initiates that adhered to this Hermetic spirituality. In light of the paucity of external testimonia relating to the existence of a Hermetic milieu, the writings of the alchemist Zosimos of Panopolis are of singular importance. In the figure of Zosimos, we meet a genuine Hermetic practitioner who regards the revelations of Hermes as sacred texts, survivals in Greek of the ancient priestly wisdom of Egypt. Zosimos discovers in the Hermetic writings an initiatory praxis, a way of salvation, which serves as the spiritual foundation for his alchemy. His work also exemplifies, in a striking way, the meeting and cross-fertilization of the Hermetic and Gnostic currents in Apply per Egypt. Just as some Gnostics evidently considered the Hermetic writings worthy additions to their libraries, so Hermetic initiates, like Zosimos, found a congenial spirituality in the Gnostic scriptures. For Zosimos, the close parallels between the revelations of Jewish Gnostic visionaries, like Nikotheos and Zostrianos, and the revelations of the Egyptian Hermes attest to more than a shared cultural and religious milieu. These links seem, to him, to confirm the existence of a primordial alchemical tradition, transmitted from remote antiquity through secret currents of initiation, passing first to the sanctuaries of the Egyptian temples, and subsequently to the Hebrew, Greek, and Persian sages who sought initiation at the feet of the Egyptian priests. Part I of this paper explores the recurring theme of the unity of Egyptian and Hebrew wisdom against the background of this esoteric conception of tradition. Part II establishes the actual sources, Hermetic and Gnostic, that seem to Zosimos to preserve and transmit the spiritual principles of this initiatory tradition, and which thus serve as the twin pillars of his own spiritual interpretatio, and of alchemical practices. Baptized in G35, I Zosimos on tradition and alchemy. Zosimos was a Hellenized Egyptian from Panopolis, modern-day Akhmim and Upper Egypt, just north of Nag Hammadi. Flourishing at the turn of the 4th century CE, he is the first alchemist of whom we know any biographical details. His writings are preserved along with the other remains of Greco-Egyptian alchemy in a number of Byzantine collections and in one important Syriac manuscript. Zosimos is an eclectic and imaginative thinker who develops an elaborate spiritual and cosmological interpretation of alchemical practices. He is also important as a transmitter of the earlier alchemical techniques of Maria and Democritus. Indeed, he regards himself chiefly as a faithful exponent of the methods of the ancients, for reasons relating to his conception of a primordial and unchanging alchemical tradition. Zosimos traces the origins of the sacred art to the Egyptian temples, designating it as, i.e., the art relating to the Black Land of Egypt, Egyptian KMT. Though some scholars have rejected the appeal to Egyptian provenance as a rhetorical conceit, a number of Egyptologists have argued convincingly for proto-alchemical associations in ancient Egypt. 36 Kyle A. Fraser. Certainly the goal of transforming inert matter into spiritual matter is central to Egyptian religious belief, and this transformation was understood, moreover, as a solar regeneration in which the symbolism of gold was central. In Ptolemaic temples, like Dendara, the cultic activities in the House of Gold, which involved the fabrication of divine statues according to secret methods and materials, seemed to resonate with the spiritual and technical concerns of early alchemy. The inscriptions in Dendara's House of Gold explain how complex craft instructions were concealed beneath the generic names of materials, e.g., if it says of a god that the material is electrum, this means that it is wood juniper, gilded with fine gold. Zosimos, in the Syriac survivals, repeatedly links alchemy to the ritual production of divine statues in the Egyptian cult, which sometime as involved chemical transformations. He describes secret recipes used by the priests for blackening copper and silver with sulfur, arsenic, and other reagents, CMA2-223. The genuine importance of such techniques is suggested by another of the Dendar inscriptions. If it says of a god that the material is copper, this means black bronze. Egyptian techniques for blackening silver and copper with sulfur are also described by Pliny, who claims that the black tincture symbolized the god Anubis, NH 33.31, and material evidence confirms that Egyptian artisans were experimenting with cementation methods for altering the surface color of metals at least as early as the New Kingdom. Presumably, these gilding and dyeing crafts assumed a deeper ritual and symbolic meaning within the laboratories of the Egyptian temples, where the skills of artisans were enlisted in the service of the cult mysteries. On the other hand, we surely cannot agree that alchemy as Zosimos knew it, in its mature technical and philosophical expression, was practiced and baptized in G37, the Egyptian temples, and veiled in the hieroglyphs of the sacred books of thought Hermes. By the Greco-Roman period, the rites of the Egyptian cults had already been reinterpreted in the light of Greek philosophy and cosmology, recast in the familiar terms of the late antique spiritual milieu. The Egyptian quest for solar resurrection, or rebirth with Osiris, is thus equivalent for Zosimos to the Hermetic quest for rebirth, the liberation of the divine spirit from the material cosmos and its ascent back to its celestial source. Alongside this Egyptian Hermetic tradition, Zosimos refers to a Hebrew tradition in alchemy, represented chiefly by Maria, who is revered as one of the ancient authorities, especially on the subject of alchemical technique and apparatus. In his exposition of the spiritual dimension of this Hebrew tradition, Zosimos deploys an eclectic array of sources, from the apocryphal Book of Enoch to Gnostic sources on the fringes of late antique Judaism. These esoteric and mystical currents seem, to him, to contain an initiated interpretation of Jewish wisdom that is entirely compatible with the sacred teachings of the Egyptian Hermes. In the final quittance, he even suggests that the Hebrew tradition in alchemy is derivative of the secret teachings of the Egyptian priesthood. He says that the ancients, being Egyptian prophets of the highest rank, 364-25, maintained a strict rule of secrecy. Only the Jews, operating independently of such cultic prohibitions, were able to write down and transmit this knowledge, 3065.1-2. The derivative status of Hebrew alchemy is suggested again by his claim that the Jewish alchemists imitated the Egyptian practice of engraving alchemical secrets in symbolic characters. 365.23 on the stelae of temples and tombs, Esak the Egyptians, 365.26. In the Syriac manuscript, the primacy of the Egyptian priestly tradition is also stressed. Zosimos notes with a hint of disapproval that many alchemists take credit for knowledge that really derives from the sacred books of Hermes. On the other hand, the Jewish appropriation and transmission of Egyptian alchemy should not be construed as a criticism. With respect, 38 Kyle A. Fraser to the secrecy of the Egyptian priests, Zosimos concedes, both in the final quittance 365.1 and repeatedly in the Syriac texts, that jealousy is a factor. He looks upon the dissemination of these cult secrets as a positive development, enabling all who are so inclined to seek the alchemical gnosis. If the mysteries are necessary, this is even more reason for everyone to possess, says the Book of Alchemy. For Zosimos, there are two preeminent alchemical traditions, the Egyptian and the Hebrew, twin currents of a primordial tradition issuing from the depths of the ages. This primeval tradition stands above the vicissitudes of changing conventions and innovations. Its truths are divine truths, grounded in immaterial realities. Its principles are revealed and not discovered. Though the Hebrew sages may express these truths in a different language and form than the Egyptian priests, the esoteric core of the tradition is timeless and unalterable. In a fragment preserved by Sanchelos, Zosimos suggests that this primeval sciences was first revealed to humanity in antediluvian times by fallen angels, to a teaching he claims to have read both in the ancient and divine scriptures, presumably the Book of Enoch, and in a lost book of Hermes called the Physica. The original revelation was preserved in the Book of Comens, one of the gigantic offspring of the fallen angels and their human consorts. How this text of alchemical wisdom was supposed to have been transmitted is not explained. Somehow its content was taken up by the Egyptian priesthood and incorporated into the sacred books of Hermes. Thence, presumably, it baptized in G39, was absorbed by the Hebrew, Persian, and Greek sages who were supposed to have traveled to Egypt to receive initiation in the temples. Zosimos shares with many of his late antique contemporaries the universalist view that the philosophical and spiritual traditions of the ancient world are complementary, once grasped in their inner significance. This belief is grounded in his conception of an tradition which has been preserved, in diverse forms, in all of the sacred traditions of antiquity. On the face of it, the claim that the priestly traditions of Egypt are essentially identical to the spiritual traditions of the Hebrews sounds fantastic. However, for Zosimos, the Egyptian tradition is really synonymous with the Hermetic tradition, while the wisdom of the Hebrews is chiefly exemplified by Jewish apocryphal writings and Gnostic scriptures. These are the sources, Hermetic and Gnostic, that support Zosimos' belief in the unity of the Egyptian and Hebrew traditions. No doubt, Zosimos sometimes exaggerates the parallels between these sources, or mistakes general analogies for relations of identity. Given his strong commitment to the idea that alchemical truths are timeless and unalterable, such translations are inevitable. Indeed, some of the correspondences that impress Zosimos seem to be commonplace ideas, originating in a shared Platonic background. For instance, the dualist anthropology of the carnal man and the luminous or pneumatic man. However, if we look more closely at the way in which this particular Platonic topos is deployed in his sources, a deeper complementarity becomes evident. The redemption of the pneumatic man in both traditions is associated with a distinctive baptismal initiation, a baptism in gnosis, which confers total enlightenment and salvific union with the divine. This idea of a Gnostic baptism is of special interest to Zosimos because it suggests an analogy with the alchemical baptism of the metals. Just as the base metals are immersed in the divine waters of the alchemical vessel and transformed irrevocably into silver and gold, so the alchemist, cleansed of his material and psychic accretions, attains spiritual perfection through the transformative power of gnosis. Part 2 of this paper is devoted to a fuller exposition of the spiritual alchemy of Zosimos, with a special focus on this theme of baptism and gnosis, tracing its hermetic and Gnostic antecedents and distilling its alchemical significance. 40 Kyle A. Fraser, The Spiritual Alchemy of Zosimos, Aya. Alchemy as Ritual Technology. The tradition of Greco-Egyptian alchemy comes gradually to assume the priority of a spiritual alchemy, veiled in the external procedures of metallic transmutation. This spiritual interpretation is grounded in the philosophical and initiatory currents, Platonist, Hermetist, and Gnostic, alive in the cultural and religious milieu of Greco-Roman Egypt. In the writings of Zosimos, the ritual and cosmological dimensions of alchemical practice are made explicit. Alchemy, as interpreted by Zosimos, is not a human innovation aimed at finite, material ends the production of gold and silver for their own sake. It is a sacred technology which aims at cosmic regeneration, the purification of the divine spirit which has fallen into the sphere of fatality and embodiment. The methodical and repetitive operations enacted in the vessel have a ritual function, based upon, and in turn reinforcing, hidden correspondences between the divine spirit in nature and the inner spirit of the alchemist. Zosimos' dual formulation above underlines this symmetry. The alchemist seeks simultaneously to liberate the spirit mixed into the flesh and the soul which is ensnared in the elements. In order to appreciate the basis for this spiritual allegory, a brief overview of the physical processes and materials employed in alchemy may be helpful. In a typical operation, the impure metal lead, copper, or some alloy of the two is placed in the upper part of the circulatory vessel, or, while the medicines or reagents are located in the base, heated below by a furnace. The lead copper is exposed to ascending vapors of sulfur, which slowly dissolve the metals and, as we would say, transform them into their sulfides. The lead copper sulfide condenses in the upper regions of the vessel and drains back into the base. This so-called divine water is once baptized in G41, again heated, so that a continuous cycle of vaporization and condensation is set in motion within the hermetically sealed vessel. The initial product is a blackened mass or liquid, which the alchemists understand as the prime matter of the metals, symbolically linked to the black earth of Egypt, from which derives its name. This black earth is next subjected to a series of further purifications, employing vapors of mercury, sulfur, and arsenic, thought capable of generating silver and gold. These transmutations were signaled by a sequence of color changes, as the blackened lead copper first turned silvery white and then golden. The tincturing vapors were conceived, in a stoic manner, as manifest ions of the divine spirit trapped within the minerals of sulfur, mercury, and arsenic. This spirit was liberated through the agency of fire, and then redirected towards the spiritualization of the metallic world. In this way, the alchemist participated in creation, awakening the divine spirit and releasing its creative potency. As Zosimos puts it, the symbol of is taken from the creation of the cosmos, CAG 2:13-15-16. As in the Platonic theurgy developed by his contemporary Iamblichus, the ritual sacrifice of matter to its spiritual source was understood as purifying also the body and soul of the alchemist. The release of the indwelling spirit in the metals coincided, through cosmic sympathy, with the liberation of the divine spirit in the human. This resonance between the inner and outer dimensions of alchemy could be expressed in terms of the symbolism of baptism. The vapors or spirits which color the prime matter are typically called sial, tinctures, or sial, deep tinctures, tinctures that penetrate the mass of the material substrate through and through, resulting in a total transformation. Now, the terms "and" are related to the verb to dip or dye, which is the root of the intensive, to baptize. Already in the alchemical literature preceding Zosimos, the etymological and symbolic links between alchemical tincturing and baptism formed the basis for a spiritual interpretation of the great work. An early tractate entitled Dialogue of the Philosophers and Cleopatra describes the alchemical vessel in allegorical 42 Kyle A. Fraser terms as the tomb and womb of rebirth. Recall that for the early Christians and Gnostics, following Paul, the baptismal font was imagined as the tomb and womb of the resurrected Christ. Analogously, the could be imagined as the tomb in which the base metals are initially decomposed and the womb from which they are subsequently reborn as luminous, spiritu aelist metals. The divine water is the pharmakon, which first poisons and decomposes the metals in Hades, the lowest part of the vessel, and then resurrects them, nourishing them like embryos in the womb. The waves and surges bound them one after another in Hades, in the tomb in which they lie. When the tomb is opened, they shall rise up from Hades like the babe from the womb. 293, 2325. Elsewhere, Cleopatra likens the metals to spring flowers which clothe 293.11 themselves in brilliant colors. The sequential color changes which mark the stages of transmutation are imagined in terms of baptismal investiture, stripping away the soiled garment of flesh and putting on the glorious light of divinity. 297.4 cf. 297.4 c all 7. These images of baptism and investiture clearly suggest that alchemical transmutation involved an internal, spiritual purification and redemption. The spiritual background of this tractate is difficult to determine with precision. Regine Chiron has recently illuminated a number of striking analogies between Cleopatra's allegory and the pronoia hymn of the Apocryphon of John. However, she concludes that the specifically Gnostic elements of that hymn are absent in Cleopatra's account. The final goal of Cleopatra's alchemy is not the liberation of spirit from matter, in the Gnostic vein, but the reunification of spirit, soul, and body in a higher synthesis. The doctrine of the spiritual body of resurrection seems to be in the background, and the allegory employs Pauline baptismal motifs and terminology throughout. There can be no doubt, however, that the baptism of the metals results in their total transformation from a state of imperfection to a state of permanence and incorruptibility. In gold, matter and spirit are fused in a higher and indissoluble synthesis. They have all been united in love, the body, the soul, and the spirit, and have become one being in which the mystery is concealed. 297. 56 cf. 297, 21, 22, 294, 22, 2019. Cleopatra's allegory suggests that the baptized alchemist undergoes a comparable transformation from a state of base mortality, baptized in G43, to a state of immortality, attaining union with the divine. For that activity is divine which, through its union with divinity, brings substances to divine completion. 296.5-6. This baptism, in other words, is a complete initiation resulting in enlightenment and apotheosis. Cleopatra's allegory borders, at least in this regard, on a Gnostic reading of the Pauline doctrine of resurrection, which would directly identify baptism with gnosis and salvation. This Gnostic interpretation of baptism becomes explicit in the works of Zosimos, i.e.b. Zosimos' Hermetic and Sethian sources. In the final quittance, Zosimos warns Theosebia of the dangers of working with astrological and demonic powers in alchemy, advising her to maintain a steadfast spiritual discipline so that she can master the daemons, after the example of Solomon, instead of being mastered by them. His advice to Theosebia directly addresses the esoteric understanding of the alchemy baptism of the metals and gives us invaluable insight into the Hermetic sources that support that understanding. In this key passage, Zosimos alludes to two of the Hermetic tractates extant in our Byzantine collection of the Corpus Hermeticum. The Poimandres, CHI, presents the famous account of the fall of the Amphropos, the luminous son of the supreme god. Zosimos here advises Theosebia that the goal of alchemy is to redress this fallen condition. He urges her to resist the downward attraction of the body and its appetites, which led to the original fall, and to return to her spiritual origin as a child of Poimandres. The participle, completed or perfected, has an initiatory sense, implying the attainment of gnosis and salvific union with the divine. This alchemical initiate initius alchemical initiation is presented, moreover, in the terms of a baptism. The realization of the tinctures, or S, which transform the base metals in the alchemical vessel, coincides with the alchemist's spiritual baptism and ascent to Poimandres. This notion of baptism derives from a tractate, ch4, entitled The Crater or Monad. Here, Hermes employs an allegory to explain to his son Tat the difference between the initiated and the profane. The Demium 44 Kyle A, Fraser urge, Hermes says, filled with and sent it to the lower world, along with a herald who called forth all who were willing to receive gnosis through a baptism in mind. All those who heeded the proclamation and were baptized in mind, these received thee and became complete, men, ch4-4. The parallel with Zosimos' text is reinforced by the shared initiatory language. Hermes' reference to the baptized as complete men is answered by Zosimos'. The Hermetic is symbolic of the mind itself. To be baptized in its intelligible waters is to withdraw into the interiority of, so as to realize one's essential freedom from embodiment. This baptism involves a tortuous ascent, ch4-9, through the astral pathways, IV8 toward union with the one and only mine. In the course of this ascent, the outer layers of body and soul are sacrificed to their planetary and stellar principles, laying bare the inner pneumatic self. Then, once he has stripped away the influences of the cosmic order, he enters the sphere of the Ogdoad, possessing only his inherent power, ch26. In the alchemical context, this stripping away or cleansing 13.7 of the garments of embodiment is paralleled by the stripping away of the imperfections of the metals and their reduction to prime matter. The deep tinctures, which are then applied as divine waters, transforming the prime matter through and through into silver and gold, are mirrored inwardly by the transformative power of gnosis. The nous filled of Hermes obviously reminds us of the in which Plato's demiurge mixes the stuff of the world soul in the Timaeus 41. However, the idea of baptism in the is a strange twist. In the context of the pagan mysteries, the is a cup in which wine is mixed for sacramental consumption. As the Stugier argues, we see in this tractate the merging of two distinct ritual practices, one Eucharistic, the other baptismal. In a brilliant analysis, he traced the origins of this conflation to a Gnostic account, the story of Jesus' miraculous conversion of a pitcher of Eucharistic wine into baptismal water, recounted both in the Pistis Sophia and the Book of Jude. However, in keeping with his typical depreciation of the spiritual content of the Hermetica, Festugier concluded that the Hermetic mysteries baptized in G45 of baptism and rebirth are literary mysteries, which merely mimic the lived realities of Gnostic initiation and ritual praxis. The Sethian Gnostic texts unearthed at Nag Hammadi strengthened Festugieri's conjecture that the Hermetic baptism of CH4 reflects a Gnostic influence. These Sethian scriptures reveal a highly spiritualized baptismal mystery, closely associated with an ascent into the divine world and culminating in the attainment of gnosis, a conception strikingly reminiscent of our Hermetic baptism. The Sethian Gnostics identify themselves as the immovable race or nomadic seed of Seth, the bearers of the original light spark who await redemption from their cosmic prison. Following a distinct quantitative exegetical approach to Genesis, the Sethian texts identify the Creator as a corrupt divinity and his creation as a degradation from the pleroma or spiritual world. They describe the descent of various redeemers, sometimes Seth himself in his pre-existent form, sometimes manifestations of the Divine Mother Forethought or Barbelo. Jesus typically figures as the incarnation of these heavenly redeemers, the garment which they don to infiltrate the fallen world of the demiurge and which they sacrifice upon their ascension. These redeemers reveal away a salvation, a spiritual baptism and sealing which strips away the garment of ignorance in exchange for a luminous garment of gnosis. Through this mystic baptism, the race of Seth hoped to attain salvific union with their divine source in the pleroma. In the earliest Sethian texts, like the Apocryphon of John, the emphasis is on the origins and enslavement of the seed of Seth, and the descent of the Redeemer who confers the baptismal mysteries. Later sources, like Zostrianos and Allogenes, focus instead on the way back, describing a visionary ascent of the initiate, which culminates in gnosis and union with the ineffable first principle. In Zostrianos, the stages of this ascent are characterized as baptisms and sealings in the luminous waters of the intelligible world. The ineffable Father is imagined as a wellspring, which overflows in the disclosure of its own thinking, producing forethought, the Barbelo Aeon. Barbelo then functions as the womb of the pleromic world, giving birth to the self-originate Aeon, the Sun, and its subordinate powers. Zostrianos in his ascent is baptized 46, Kyle A. Fraser in the heavenly waters of each of these subordinate aeons in turn until finally attaining the perfection of gnosis, a vision of the unity of all the aeons and the first principle, and there I saw all these spiritual beings as they exist in one, and I became unified with all of them. Whereas ordinary Christian water baptism merely reinforces human enslavement to the archons, the heavenly baptism of the Sethians was believed to strip away the demon-ridden garment of matter, liberating the inner spirit from the lower strata of body and soul, and sealing it in the luminous armor of gnosis. As in the Hermetic baptism, the Sethian baptism is associated with a rite of celestial ascent, which cleanses the pneumatic self of its material and psychic accretions and confers gnosis. One sees vestiges in the Sethian materials of a liturgical framework, suggesting that this mystical baptism may have evolved from an older water rite. However, the characteristic ritual components of water baptism immersion, disrobing and enrobing, seem to have been experienced inwardly, as acts of mental transformation, conceptual refinement, and abstraction from the world of psychic and sensible experience. Like the Gnostic baptism to which Hermes calls his disciples in Ch. 4th, the Sethian baptism was a spiritual transformation and rebirth effected through immersion in the intelligible waters of the divine world. These analogies suggest some kind of interface of hermetism with Sethian circles over the course of the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE. By the time of Zosimos, writing at the beginning of the 4th century, this cross-fertilité Ishan of the Egyptian and Hebrew Gnostic currents seems to have been well established in the cultural milieu of Upper Egypt, as evidenced by the Hermetic survivals in the Nag Hammadi collection. In his work on the Lati ter Omega Meim, Oth. Zosimos states that the fall of the luminous man, which alchemy seeks to remedy, is a common teaching of the Hebrews and the sacred books of Hermes, Mem, Oth, 14748. Both traditions hold to a distinction between the inner pneumatic man, the man of light, and the external bodily man, whom the Hebrews call Adam and the Egyptians Thoth, I 87-88. On the Hermetic side, I have already noted Zosimos' familiarity baptized in G47 with the Poimandres account of the fall of the Anthropos. As regards his Hebrew sources, the evidence suggests a Sethian influence. Zosimos attributes the fall of the light man to the deception of the archons, who clothed him in a garment created from fate and the four elements, I 140. Likewise, in the Apocryphon of John NHC 2, 1, 2021, the archons model the body of the carnal Adam out of earth, water, fire, and the spirit of matter and ignorance, the so-called counterfeit spirits. Zosimos speaks similarly of a counterfeit daimon, a deceiver who claims in blasphemy that he is the Son of God, and who attempts to maintain Adam's enslavement to the forces of fatality, I 14-15. The true Son of God, he says, is Jesus Christ, who appeared in the form of a suffering man, but in reality suffered nothing. This is a clear statement of the docetic Christology shared by Sethian and Valentinian Gnostics. Jesus is the material garment of the heavenly Redeemer, which is stripped away at the crucifixion, revealing the illusion of suffering and death. Following the example of Christ, the initiate must crucify his material garment, his proper Adam, W-I, 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 W-1, W-A, W-A, Dalari-1, W-O. This stripping away of the external dross of the body reveals the hidden pneumatic self, just as the alchemical dissolution of the base metals is the necessary preliminary to the production of silver and gold. Zosimos refers twice to a mysterious figure called Nikotheos. He says that Nikotheos, the undiscoverables, a nu and retitoj, knows the true name of the pneumatic man, whom the unenlightened can name only by way of metaphor, as luminous, man, mem, oth. I 97-1003. In a similar vein, he says that Nikotheos alone knows the immaterial meaning of the letter omega. In the terms of mundane speech, omega corresponds to the outermost circle of Chronos, which comprehends the entire cosmos. But according to Maetet 48, Kyle A. Fraser real speech, the logoi of the divine world, omega presumably signifies the more substantial totality of the pleroma. The epithets of Nikotheos, hidden and undiscoverables, seem to imply that he has been translated into the divine world, in the manner of Enoch, attaining a privileged insight into the noetic structure of the pleroma. Porphyry, at Vita Plotini 16, mentions a number of Gnostic attributed to Zoroaster, Zostrianos, Alogenes, and Nikotheos, which were critiqued in Plotinus's school as examples of bad Platonism. He says that these revelations prompted Plotinus's well-known polemic against the Gnostics. I have already discussed the revelations of Zostrianos and Alogenes as typical late Sethian works, which detail a mystical ascent and baptism in the luminous waters of the pleroma. Porphyry's grouping of an apocalypse of Nikotheos with those of Zostrianos and Alogenes suggests that it too belongs to this Platonizing Sethian tradition. Evidently, Nikotheos is a Sethian visionary, like Zostrianos, who ascends into the pleroma and returns with a gnosis that can only be expressed to the uninitiated in the veiled forms of material speech. Nikotheos is mentioned in another late Sethian work, contained in the Codex Brucianus, as one who has seen the ineffable Father face to face. This distinction between the tongue of the flesh and the immaterial discourse of the pleroma is exactly paralleled by Zosimos' claims that Nikotheos alone knows the immaterial, meaning of the letter omega, and the hidden name of the pneumatic man. It seems probable that Zosimos and the untitled text of the Bruce Codex are dependent on a common source relating to Nikotheos, which may well be the very apocalypse referenced by Porphyry. Zosimos evidently regards Nikotheos as a preeminent authority concern, eyeing the essence of the pneumatic man and the architecture of the pleroma. The revelations of Nikotheos, esoterically interpreted, are complementary to the revelations of Hermes himself. The parallels established earlier between Hermetism and Sethian productions, like Zostrianos, are key to understanding his point of view. In both traditions, one hears the call of the illuminated baptized in G49 prophet, Hermes, Zostrianos, or Nikotheos, to abandon the body and its impurities and ascend into the luminous waters of the intelligible world, exchanging ignorance for gnosis and death for a rebirth in mind. It is on the basis of this initiatory model that Zosimos builds his distinctive interpretation of the alchemical, baptism, and spiritual rebirth of the metals. II. Baptism and sacrifice in the visions of Zosimos. A full treatment of the baptismal motif in Zosimos requires an examination, however brief, of his so-called visions, a dream sequence full of bizarre and violent images. Zosimos dreams of a sacrificial altar in the form of an alembic, Rai X 1018, positioned at the top of a staircase. The priest presiding over the sacrifice declares that he has descended 15 steps of darkness, EX22, and ascended 15 luminous steps, EX23, sacrificing the coarseness of the body, EX24, in order to be initiated as a spirit, EX25. This work of alchemical initiation involves a descent into the darkness of Hades, which represents at once the spiritual darkness of the alchemist and the physical blackening of the metals in the nether regions of the unity of these inner and outer dimensions is symbolized above all by the men of copper and lead, who throughout the visions are flayed, dismembered, and boiled alive in the divine waters of the vessel, awaiting their spiritual transformation into men of silver and gold. As in the allegory of Cleopatra, the alchemical vessel is at once the tomb and womb of rebirth, sacrificial altar, and baptismal font, since the cleansing of the metals requires first their reduction to a blackened prime matter. Likewise, on the esoteric level, the killing of the outer atom is the necessary condition for the rebirth of the pneumatic man. Zosimos tries to ascend 7 steps, HXI2, no doubt representing the 7 planetary spheres through which the initiate must pass in order to return to the pleroma. Twice he loses his way and, discouraged 50 Kyle A. Fraser by his lack of progress, falls asleep XI5F27F. This illustrates the psychoec logical dimension of the alchemical blackening, the leaden inertia of the soul weighed down by material entanglements. In the famous temple allegory, X1000-1018, the recalcitrant nature of matter is symbolized by a serpent that guards the narrow entryway into the alchemical temple. The serpent must be sacrificed and flayed, 109, its parts reconfigured into a step, 112, on which the alchemist can climb into the sanctuary. Within the pure waters, 103, of the temple, the man of copper is transformed into a man of gold, 118. On the most immediate level, the temple symbolizes the alchemical vessel and its divine waters, and the serpent, which guards the narrow entry, represents the base earthiness of the metals which must be neutralized before the work of transformation can begin. But clearly, the temple also signifies the spiritual goal of the alchemist, the pleromic homeland from which he is exiled. In Valentinian Gnosticism, the pleroma was imagined as a celestial temple, veiled from the fallen material cosmos, which could only be regained through the mysteries of baptism and the bridal chamber. The holy building is baptism, the holy of holy is the ransom, the holy of holies is the bridal chamber. Baptism possesses resurrection and ransom is in the bridal chamber. It seems likely that Zosimos is drawing on this Valentinian imagery relating to the celestial temple. If so, it is tempting to suppose that the pure waters of the temple represent not only the divine waters of the vessel, but on a more esoteric level, the Ionic waters of the pleroma in which the Gnostic initiate is baptized in the course of his ascent. A concluding dilemma: what is purified in alchemy, spirit or matter? The Sethian sources sometimes speak of baptism as a killing or crucifixion of the world and its corrupt cosmic rulers, where this seems really to be a metaphor for the withdrawal of the initiate from external entanglements. In the alchemical interpretation, this idea of crucifying the world is taken rather more literally. The self-sacrifice and purification of the alchemist finds its ritual expression in that flaying and dissolution of the metals which is so graphically allegorized in the visions. The alchemical interpretation of baptized in G51 baptism thus moves beyond the goal of human redemption to a much wider goal of cosmic redemption. There is an implication in alchemy that the cosmos can be redeemed and made sacred, but it is precisely on this point that we encounter a deep and perhaps insurmountable tension in the position of Zosimos, which seems to originate in his Sethian sources. In the final quittance, Zosimos presents the goal of alchemy as a total liberation from the material world, advising Theosebea to spit on matter once she has realized the tinctures. In light of the external procedures of alchemy, this cosmic stance is surprising. Certainly, in the initial phases of the operation, there occurs a separating out of prime matter and the divine spirits or vapors. But this separation is not an end in itself. It is only once the blackened substrate has been isolated that the real work of transmutamation begins, as the alchemist now proceeds to realize in that substratum the distinctive properties of silver and gold. Alchemy, like iamblichan theurgy, aims ultimately at the sacralization of the cosmos, the reconciliation of matter and spirit in a higher and more stable synthesis. Gold, in its immunity to fire and its incorruptibility, symbolizes the spiritualization of matter. What Zosimos represents as the ultimate goal of alchemy, the liberation of the spirit trapped in matter, seems instead to describe its preliminary phase. This tendency towards a dualism of spirit and matter is, arguably, a reflecting ion of Zosimos' Sethian sources, which teach that the created universe is a degradation from the heavenly pleroma. For the Hermetic tradition, the realization of gnosis does not imply the rejection of the material universe. Gnosis is described instead as a noetic transformation, from an embodied and finite perspective to a transcendent perspective in which the outer cosmos is perceived within mind. As Tat exclaims in a visionary moment, "I am in heaven, in earth, water, and air. I am in animals and plants, in the womb, before the womb, and after the womb, everywhere." Ch. 3 and 11. The Sethian notion of a rupture between the created world and the spiritual universe is nowhere to be found in the Hermetica. This distinction gives us a clearer insight into what it means to speak of alchemy as a properly Hermetic science. The phases of alchemy seem to reflect the phases of Hermetic initiation, from an initial blackening, an experience of spiritual disorientation and imprisonment, to a higher realization of the unity of spirit and matter. a gnosis or enlightenment symbolized for the alchemists by gold.